Planning and the Classless Society by Wolfgang Abendroth. Wolfgang Abendroth, born in Wuppertal-Elberfeld, Germany, in 1906, studied and practiced law in the courts of Germany until 1933. In Bern, he completed his studies for the Doctor of Law degree, but was imprisoned in 1937 because of illegal activities against the Third Reich. At the end of World War II, he entered the Ministry of Justice in Brandenburg and the German administration of the Soviet zone of occupation. He is now professor of law at the University of Marburg an der Lahn and has taught at the universities of Halle. Is it Halle? Can't remember how to pronounce German words. Universities of Halle, Leipzig, Jena, and at the College for Social Sciences in Wilhelmshaven. In 1961, he was expelled from the SPD because of his support for the German Socialist Student Union. He is a member of the Executive Committee of the German Socialist Union and author of German Trade Unions, Bureaucratic Administration, and Social Democracy, and The Rise of the Crisis of German Social Democracy. The problem of administration and planning under organized capitalism. Organized capitalism grew directly from liberal capitalism, spurred by the concentration and centralization of capital, as well as by accelerated technological development which served to expand productivity. Embedded in organized capitalism is the problem of the relationship between planning and economic administration, and also between management and economic administration. The earliest development of organized capital was already distinguished by the rise of the limited liability corporations and of joint stock companies in the place of single entrepreneurs. Quote, capital, which rests on a socialized mode of production and presupposes a social concentration of means of production and labor powers, is here directly endowed with the form of social capital, a capital of directly associated individuals as distinguished from private capital, and its enterprises assume the form of social enterprises as distinguished from individual enterprises. Social capital is the abolition of capital as private property within the boundaries of capitalist production itself. End quote. Marx. Thus, the owner of capital becomes, quote, a mere owner, a mere money capitalist, end quote, and the actual functioning capitalist becomes, quote, a mere manager, end quote. In contemporary terminology, a member of management who, quote, receives a mere wage for a certain kind of skilled labor, the price of which is regulated in the labor market like that of any other labor, end quote, Marx. Furthermore, quote, the wages of superintendents, both for the commercial and the industrial manager, appear completely separated from the profits of enterprise in the cooperative factories of the laborers as well as in capitalistic stock companies, end quote. Since, quote, a numerous class of industrial and commercial superintendents was formed, even the last pretext for the confusion in matters of profit of enterprise and wages of management was removed. In theory, mere surplus value, a value for which no equivalent was paid, realized unpaid labor, end quote. Similarly, quote, above the actual director is placed a board of managers or directors, for whom superintendents and management serve in reality only as a pretext for plundering stockholders and amassing wealth, end quote. The system is prima facie, quote, a mere phase of transition to a new form of production, end quote. Also, quote, it establishes a monopoly in certain spheres and thereby challenges the interference of the state. It presupposes a new aristocracy of finance, a new sort of parasite in the shape of promoters, speculators, and merely nominal directors. A whole system of swindling and cheating by means of corporation juggling, stock jobbing, and stock speculation. It is private production without the control of private property. End quote. This altered system, however, immediately expands the sphere of planning, first by enlarging and then by automatic combining of enterprises. Quote, the opposition between the organization of production in the single factory and the anarchy of production in the whole of society, end quote, is eliminated. In the combines, e.g., the trusts, the problem is, as it were, pushed back. Quote, in the trusts, freedom of competition changes into freedom of competition's very opposite, into monopoly, and the production without any definite plan of capitalistic society capitulates to the production upon a definite plan of the invading socialist society. Certainly, this is so far still to the benefit and advantage of the capitalist, end quote. Thus, quote, the capitalist relationship is not abolished, end quote. The scope of planning is expanded, but profit remains the goal of planning. The abstractly theoretical hostility to planning, however, has lost all sense and motivation. Where, from the social standpoint of management, it is still asserted its only function is that of an ideology arising from the objectivity of social consciousness. It assumed the character of cynical manipulation which shows itself in the regular activity of management. This managerial activity shows itself first in the sphere of organizing internal production and distribution of the specific economic combination. Secondly, in the differentiation, formerly still mediated through the market, from other economic structures which always shows anew that its field is still only, quote, the market, in the old sense como grano salis, while only a moment before it was based on pure competition. There are numerous agreements of suppression of small and middle productive, distributive, and credit enterprises which, while retaining formal and juridical independence, lose the possibility of economic self-determination and free development. Alongside of this are power agreements with other great combines which, only in the intermediate stages of the power struggle, use simple competition as transitional to the appropriation of the motive forces of the earlier markets. Thirdly and finally, management is always differentiated from the state, the communes, and the necessary organs of political determination to prevent the use of public power and to employ it in its own interest. But all three spheres of public activity have evidently very little in common with, quote, free enterprise, in the sense of the liberal capitalistic world. Since the planning of organized capitalism is determined by that organized sector of the economy which is taken as the starting point, its inner contradictions are sharpened. Therefore, in spite of the internationalization of production, national boundaries or combinations, such as the common market, are usually arranged to be able to influence the public struggle. Furthermore, just as many countries find their many-sided reciprocal economic spheres overlap, so too their respective planning goals are sharply contradictory, and their reciprocal agreements are most unstable. Their agreements to limit production artificially, or to divide markets or spheres of capital investment among themselves. At the same time, these agreements can break up because of the law of uneven development, as Ernest Mandel shows in his detailed examination of many examples of political planning and their consequences of a great number of European and American combines and cartels between the World Wars and World War II. Therefore, from a long-range international perspective, international planning in no way lessens the inner contradictions of the capitalist mode of production, and thus the danger of crisis. that the struggle for power is determined by economic crises in the form of political crises was first described theoretically by Rudolf Hilferding in 1910. Currently, George W. F. Hallgarten, by a careful study of extensive empirical data, proves that the tendency of governments to pursue an imperialistic foreign policy and to issue warlike statements has not changed, particularly when a top-level mobilization order can guarantee their business and risk-free profit, which would otherwise be threatened by the danger of recession or crisis. As a result of the unproductivity of public expenditures brought about by organized capitalism, strong inflationary tendencies arise which, in turn, accelerate the tendency to instability. Thus, the modern state, which rests on the foundation of an advanced capitalist society, is increasingly forced to choose between economic crises and permanent direct subsidy of the value of money. It thereby repeatedly expropriates the reserve capital of its lower and middle strata. The basis for the budget proposed but not fully revealed by the late President Kennedy was necessitated, despite massive rearmament, by the high rate of unemployment, currently at 5.9%. Under such circumstances, organized capitalism's management inevitably sanctions, in its own interest, a transition from merely occasional state intervention to simultaneous state administration, by the distribution of public funds, of an expanding sector of the social product. In armaments capitalism, the main beneficiary of this public expenditure is the group of great combines of organized capitalism. However, it is precisely this use of public funds to secure the relatively long-lasting stability of the special sector, which makes it possible for other groups, depending on their strength, to bring pressure for concessions of the welfare state type. Thus, workers become involved in political controversy over pay, or over working conditions, e.g., working time, and relatively favorable compromises are secured on questions of social legislation. This administrative tendency to compromise prevails only with management's influential privileges in government and its control of the economic balance of power, and obviously comes to an end during severe recessions. The tendency then becomes retrogressive, and can suddenly turn from the mere administration of preparedness to a drive for open war planning. In that event, liberal capitalism's ideological taboo against planning is sawed off. Planning holds no terror for management of organized capitalism because, in its experience, modern war, even when it is not atomic, can be prepared for and conducted only by means of total planning in conjunction with an economy based on scarcity and consumer rationing. Under the given circumstances, as was proved by the behavior of German combines during World War II, management is prepared to push forward the expansion of centralized production by combining primitive plunder with every additional violation of humanity that suits its purpose. It is typical of the mentality of the great powers influenced by management that, when it became politically opportune to turn from right to grace, the situation at the end of World War II prevented neither amnesty nor the return of their property to those industrial leaders who were accessories to such acts of horror. The readiness to support immediate war planning means, since the example of the Third Reich, the potential readiness for complicity in a plan whose concrete content is systematized barbarism. The tendency to, quote, total war, preparedness, gives rise to greater difficulties primarily because the anticipation of immediate profits results in the development of overcapacity, which cannot be fully utilized. It thus becomes a threat to profits and leads to recession and consequent breakdown of equilibrium. This strengthens the presupposition that the technical revolution of the 20th century, predominantly in research and development, could have been, and was, brought about only by the total economic might of the advanced capitalist countries and not by the efficiency of an individual trust. Thus, during World War I, it was owing to the German government's war economy that the chemical industry expanded enormously and thereby developed far-reaching production of inorganic fertilizers and synthetic textiles. Thus, during World War II, it was due to the war planning of the United States that the prerequisites were developed for the utilization of atomic energy and radar technology as prerequisites to the further development of automation. This system can concede a relatively high standard of living, not voluntarily, but only as a compromise in the class struggle. As a result, even an author like Jürgen Habermas, who eminently recognizes the cultural and socio-philosophical grounds of the system's irrationality, nevertheless seems to postulate first that the present state of affairs is permanent, stable and unthreatened, and second, that it has abolished the source of socio-psychological division. It is no accident that such an informed and acute observer of the current scene as Jürgen Habermas could be won over by the continuous economic progress of the German Federal Republic with its full employment and its almost completely contained socialist class consciousness. Has it been forgotten that the 1929 crisis struck down just such a sense of stability and plunged the workers' standard of living to zero? Wasn't it inherent in that system to beget the Third Reich? Is the permanent structural unemployment in the United States a negligible quantity? Finally, isn't the impulse of alienation in this society, which Habermas sees and whose origins he aptly explains, also determined in his view by the economic structure? Doesn't it characteristically tend to transform economic into political catastrophes? Doesn't its latent power become glaringly obvious in its ever more naked and undisguised elevation of extreme barbarism to power? Isn't the key to the problem of the relationship between the conditions of the classes, isn't the relation to the problem of the relation between the condition of the classes and the workers' class consciousness contained in Marx's opposition to Lassalle's iron law of wages? Quote, consequently, the system of wage labor is a system of slavery, and indeed of a slavery which becomes more severe in proportion as the social productive forces of labor develop, whether the worker receives better or worse payment. It is as if among slaves who have at last got behind the secret of slavery and broken out in rebellion, a slave still enthralled to obsolete notions were to inscribe on the program of the rebellion, slavery must be abolished because the feeding of slaves in the system of slavery cannot exceed a certain low maximum. End quote, Marx. And is it true that the proletarian class consciousness has disappeared in the other highly industrialized countries where, on the social basis of organized capitalism, the workers have at long last obtained a higher standard of living? Is it true in France, Finland, Belgium, England, and North Italy? The thinking of the ruling class has a different relationship indeed to organized capitalism than it formerly had to liberal capitalism, not only with regard to state intervention, but also to managerialism and the formulation of planning. The intervention is no longer regarded as the devil's work. In the most advanced capitalist countries and their alliances, such as Union Miniere and the European Common Market, managerialism and planning are recognized as the obvious overall system because of the threat of recessions and crises. In the first place, however, it is conceded that potential decision makers of managerialism, with its eventual planning, are only in management and its allied groups in political leadership, administration, and the state apparatus. This is particularly evident in the formation of the European superstructures. It is also evident in the amendments to the Supplementary Emergency Constitution of the German Federal Republic, which, in the event of internal unrest and the threat of outbreak of war, empowers the government to suspend all democratic rights and to impose total planning, particularly for scarcity and consumer rationing, but also for the militarization of labor. Secondly, administrative measures of governments continue to be determined by the profit needs of the major economic enterprises and planning aims at the same goal, with all the irrationalities that flow from this. Organized capitalism's form of planning is necessarily irrational because it cannot formulate a rational guiding conception. It is indeed fitting that even the political structure can be planned in this social system. But since such structural expenditures are viewed as costs that diminish profits, the organization of planning at times even lags behind the immediate needs of the production apparatus. Instead of taking the lead in determining the standards for a rise in productivity, so that the participants in the socialized process of production may have meaningful, fulfilled lives. It is thus necessary for the new productive forces, which have been developed by atomic energy and automation, to press for a stronger planning tendency at the same time that they threaten to make manual labor increasingly superfluous. As in the United States today, advanced capitalism inherently produces a structural rise in unemployment and thereby disrupts its own equilibrium. Far from succeeding, however, the attempt to overcome this by traditional means and thereby to eliminate the rising dangers to the existing system serves only to sidetrack the content of planning solely to considerations of power Far from succeeding, however, the attempt to overcome this by traditional means and thereby to eliminate the rising dangers to the existing system serves only to sidetrack the content of planning solely to considerations of power and an irrational concentration on the profit motive of large individual enterprise and combinations. Such class privileges are no longer compatible with productive forces, whose constantly rising output of commodities leads to a constantly decreasing amount of socially necessary labor time. The tendency towards producing the greatest increase in the means of satisfying each participant's needs, along with the greatest increase in the free time available to him for self-development, has as its objective not only a developing possibility, but a necessary realization. Otherwise, even the use and administration of the equipment threatens to become impossible. The contradiction between the form of total social planning and the limitations imposed on total social planning by organized capitalism for its own needs must be overcome. Organized capitalism has limited the planners to its own leading strata and has limited the plan to protecting the profit possibilities of its vast economic structures. The immediate necessity of our time is for mankind to eliminate these irrationalities, which give rise to the constant danger of self-annihilation. The problem of planning in a classless society. The following well-known passage by Karl Marx comes to mind. Quote, "No social order ever disappears before all the productive forces, for which there is room in it, have been developed, and new higher relations of production never appear before the material conditions of their existence have matured in the womb of the old society. Therefore, mankind always takes up only such problems as it can solve, since, looking at the matter more closely, we will always find that the problem itself arises only when the material conditions necessary for the problem's solution already exist or are at least in the process of formation. End quote. Marx. It is clear that the meaning of the socialized labor process can only be its own freedom, which is made possible when its movement is determined by its associated cooperative members. Quote, in fact, the realm of freedom does not commence until the point is passed where labor under the compulsion of necessity and of external utility is required. In this very nature of things, it lies beyond the sphere of material production in the strict meaning of the term. Just as the savage must wrestle with nature in order to satisfy his wants, in order to maintain his life and reproduce his life, so civilized man has to do it, and he must do it in all forms of society and under all possible modes of production. With his development of the realm of natural necessity expands, because his wants increase, but at the same time forces of production increase, by which these wants are satisfied. The freedom in this field cannot consist of anything else but of the fact that socialized man, the associated producers, regulate their interchange with nature. The freedom in this field cannot consist of anything else but of the fact that socialized man, the associated producers, regulate their interchange with nature rationally, bring it under their common control, instead of being ruled by it as by some blind power, that they accomplish their task with the least expenditure of energy and under conditions most adequate to their human nature and most worthy of their human nature. But it always remains a realm of necessity. Beyond the realm of necessity begins that development of human power which is its own end, the true realm of freedom, which, however, can flourish only upon the realm of necessity as its basis. The shortening of the working day is its fundamental premise. End quote. Marx. Thus, the content of planning in a classless society is no longer determined by the abstractly rational aim of profits for single economic enterprises or trust, but, on one hand, by the explicit and always concrete rationality whose goal is the humanization of the labor process as a means of subordinating the labor process to the conscious aims of the associated working people, and, on the other hand, the greatest possible freeing of individuals from the labor process in order to secure the greatest possible measure of self-development for every member of society. Both moments of this unity are interdependent. Through the reduction of socially necessary labor time, by immediately shortening the working day, by expanding the scope and duration of education for young people, by increasing vacation time for all able-bodied producers, and by earlier retirement age, the individual's abilities and his impulse to apply those abilities are so greatly expanded that constantly expanding abilities are brought into use in the scientific preparation and administration of the labor processes of associated man. Consequently, productivity is so greatly developed and expanded that the universal satisfaction of needs and the further reduction in socially necessary labor time become possible. Because of this dialectical determination of socially regulated educational system, because of the dialectical determination of a socially regulated educational system, results whose task no longer is to develop, quote, the detailed worker, crippled by lifelong repetition of one and the same trivial operation, end quote, but the, quote, fully developed individual, fit for a variety of labors, ready to face any change of production, and to whom the different social functions he performs are but so many modes giving free scope to his own natural and acquired powers, end quote. With such a broader increase in productivity, a social order arises in which the following principle becomes a reality. Quote, from each according to his capacity, to each according to his needs, end quote. The problem of value, both in the old sense of the liberal capitalist market economy and in the modified sense of organized capitalism, is abolished. This can occur by means of all-around planning of the social labor process, because the economy is no longer determined independently of and contrary to the will of the producers by the alienated law of the market, but rather by means of the rational and conscious decisions of associated mankind. However, quote, after the abolition of the capitalist mode of production, but with social production still in vogue, the determination of value continues to prevail in such a way that the regulation of labor time and the distribution of the social labor among the various groups of production, also the keeping of accounts in connection with this, become more essential than ever, end quote. Precisely these considerations lead to the consequence that even in a classless society, only a portion of the full output of cooperative labor can be made available for individual use, namely that which remains after a series of deductions. Quote, first, cover for replacement of the means of production used up. Secondly, additional portion for expansion of production. Thirdly, reserve or insurance funds to provide against accidents, dislocations caused by natural calamities, etc. End quote. Marx. From the consumer stock, which then remains there to be deducted again, before it is divided among the producers for their individual use. Quote, first, the general cost of administration not belonging to production. This part will, from the outset, be very considerably restricted in comparison with present-day society, and it diminishes in proportion as the new society develops. Secondly, that which is intended for the common satisfaction of needs, such as schools, health services, etc. From the outset, this part grows considerably in comparison with present-day society, and it grows in proportion as the new society develops. Thirdly, funds for those unable to work, etc. Marx. I'm pretty sure that's critique of the Gotha program, but don't quote me on that. Thus, planning in an evolving classless society can never become static according to rigid patterns, but must be liberated. Jesus Christ. Thus, planning in an evolving classless society can never become static according to rigid patterns, but must be deliberated by a continuing process of development through the most rational possible relationship between the increase of productivity and the enlargement of public education on the one side, and on the other side, by a rapid reduction in labor time and an increase in social production and consumption quotas no longer dominated by the principle of equivalence. Mistakes will be made again and again, inevitably, because it is human nature to err repeatedly. And such a society will have to count on numerous setbacks in its experimentation. Classless society is a human society neither outside of historical perspective nor a paradise. But are such repeated gigantic errors in planning a greater source of loss than the sum total losses caused by liberal capitalist crises, or even by crises and objectively senseless investment of organized capitalism with its tendency to reconcile its contradictions by the production of armaments. Planning in and for the transition to a classless society. No heavily industrialized country has yet succeeded, on the basis of its own continuous internal development, in making the transition to a classless society and its rudiments of planning. The first great attempts in this direction took place in countries where the process of industrialization on the basis of capitalist production relations was only in the beginning. The fact that the fundamentals for planning a classless society were taken over by areas with largely pre-capitalist production forms and social relations, where there was only an extremely meager share of capitalistic industrial production, was certainly not expected by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, or by their intellectual heirs before World War I. But this transfer neither contradicts nor refutes their thought, because the manner in which industrial capitalism was transformed and unified, but this transfer neither contradicts nor refutes their thought, because the manner in which industrial capitalism has transformed and unified the world, which was previously predicted by Marx and Engels, has also guaranteed the transference of thought development and problem posing from developed industrial nations to those in the first stages of industrialization. Nations in the first stages of industrialization could thus take an interest in the solution of the problems that hitherto they had been unable to attempt to solve. This made it possible, in all cases where these countries were freed from foreign military intervention, for them to initiate attempts resulting from their own social or national conflicts, and on the basis of their own resources. This would not have been possible without reference to Marxist theory. Because this theory arose out of the prior development of liberal capitalism, it must be adapted to and modified by the specific problems of the new nations. Because the theory of a transition to classless society was elaborated on the basis of developed industrial production, which had already introduced public education and the disciplining of the majority of the population for the modern labor process, such conditions must first be created so that the next stage of development, the overcoming of class society, may be ushered in. Thus, in Russia, for example, it was systematic planning for essential development, instead of residual planning which accelerated economic growth. In a half-century, the population of the USSR has been transformed from preponderant illiteracy in 1917 to an average level of education and degree of scientific training that does not lag behind that of the old industrial nations whom Russia is increasingly overtaking. When Western reaction dissolved its hopes of receiving industrial aid, the USSR decided upon fully systematized planning for the building up of a highly industrialized society by means of its own resources, whereby the USSR's hopes to protect its population from the enormous burdens which early socialist accumulation must entail, as early capitalist accumulation did previously. Such planning fully executed the first 5-year plan of 1928 and resulted, as did early capitalist development in the old industrial countries, in the scourge of hunger, mass misery, and forced child labor. By means of open administrative terror, the plan was achieved at an astonishingly rapid tempo. Russia thereby narrowed its governmental system from the dictatorship of the Soviets to the dictatorship of the party, then to the dictatorship of a newly arisen bureaucracy, and finally to the brutal and bloody despotism of one man at the top. By barbarous means and frightful errors in planning, Stalin forced industrial advance and made the USSR into a world power. Nevertheless, the self-estrangement of the bureaucratic dictatorship at the same time brought forth the condition that first produced its moderation, and, by repeated repercussions, its suspension, as is the case since the 20th Party Congress. Despite the estrangement between the ruling bureaucracy and the people, no new class society could develop. The way remained open for planning a classless industrial society and for expanding the spiritual reach of freedom and social democracy. The Chinese social organization began from deeper strata than the Russian and forged similar stages of development. But it is still in its first stage. In order to explain this, its leaders still uphold the theory of Stalinism at a time when the industrially developed USSR lays Stalinism aside. The Yugoslav social organization, which started on its course under the aegis of Stalinist theory, has developed planning methods leading to a classless society, which do not contradict planning methods in a classless society, as is the case in the USSR or in China. Yugoslavia could do this because the higher degree of education and greater labor discipline of Yugoslavia's population, which rested upon greater industrial development before the victory of the People's Revolution, enabled it to assign a greater portion of its working population to the decentralized planning and administration of its productive apparatus than was possible in the USSR. Planning in the direction of a classless society has not yet succeeded in any fully developed society of organized capitalism. At the end of the world economic crisis of 1919 to 1936, the victory of the fascist counter-revolution in the European countries prevented the development of such planning, and by its war economy method of planning rescued organized capitalism. Nor were the effects of the crisis overcome in the United States by means of the New Deal, but only by the economic consequences of the outbreak of World War II. Since 1945, the Cold War and the preparedness posture of the two world powers have disrupted the beginnings of planning in a socialistic direction in England, France, and Italy. The Western European countries have been compelled to comply with United States demands and return to the prior capitalistic structure of their industrial society. Therefore, even the theory of planning for the transition of developed industrial nations to the classless society, under the full protection and further development of democratic constitutional structures, is still insufficiently developed. But such writers as A. Angelopoulos, Charles Bettelheim, and recently Ernest Mandel have produced great contributions to it. Certainly since 1956, the communist parties have convinced these Western European countries that overall planning, within the framework of a parliamentary democratic constitution, can and should result when it becomes possible for the constitutional governments to safeguard themselves against overthrow by authoritarian or fascist dictatorship. The need for such planning has been made urgent by the development of atomic energy and automation. Because they require aid for rapid industrial construction, the former colonial countries are still neo-colonial dependent nations. Internationalized planning toward a no longer antagonistic and therefore classless society has become the prerequisite for preserving civilization and for avoiding threatening political catastrophes. Translated by Raya Dunayevskaya.